Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is The World This Week. We're in the company of PENKETH, contributor to The Independent. Christian Wernicke, Paris bureau chief for Sueddeutsche Zeitung. When did you arrive?
Oh, only half a year ago.
6 months ago.
Yeah, I'm still working to
You're the
get
new
into
guy.
France, yeah.
Okay. Patrick de Saint-Exupéry, editor-in-chief of 21, the magazine. And Gerry FEEHILY, the Europe editor at the French magazine that gives you the best of the world's press, Courrier International. We were discussing before the break the situation in Rwanda and how it's difficult to overcome the scars of the past. We should tell you, across the channel in Britain this week, there was with the situation, healing the wounds of the past was on the agenda, with a first ever state visit to Britain by an Irish president since 1921 and independence. The undisputed star attraction, though, a certain member of Mike Higgins' delegation, former senior Irish Republican Army leader Martin McGuinness, one of the signatories of the Good Friday Agreement. There you see him shaking hands with the Queen. The IRA, which, let's not forget, murdered the Queen's second cousin, Lord Mountbatten, back in 1979. A page has indeed been turned.
The Irish and British are becoming good and dependable neighbours and better friends, finally shedding our inhibitions about seeing the best in each other.
Gerry FEEHILY.
Well, what we didn't see was the photograph of Martin McGuinness raising his glass of champagne to toast the Queen as they were playing God Save the Queen.
Did you ever think this day would happen?
At Windsor Castle. No, I think... do you think Martin McGuinness thought this day would happen? I was wondering what, I'd be quite curious to know what was going on in his head and also what was going on in the heads of
He's happily tweeting photos of him with members of the Irish rugby team. He's really pleased, it seems, by his trip to...
Well, in the last few years, there's been lots of all these sort of symbolic gestures going on. There was the visit of the Queen in the Republic of Ireland, which was very well received. It was very, very much covered. And then, of course, you had the very famous, very emotional moment in Croke Park, which was the site of a massacre by the British Army back in the early 20th century. Well, you had God Save the Queen being played at the beginning of a rugby match between the Irish and the English team. So we've had over the years lots of these kind of symbolic moments, and of course the celebrated photo of Martin McGuinness, who is now the Deputy Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, with Dr. Ian Paisley, who was then the First Minister of Northern Ireland. But it just has to be said at the same time. The situation in Northern Ireland, although it's hugely different to what it was back in the old days, there still persists, lurking under the surface, a kind of a communitarian division or communitarian tensions, and that's something that okay, instead of there was an interview with a woman on Bombay Street in West Belfast, a traditional Catholic neighbourhood there. She was saying, they're only throwing stones and petrol bombs at us now. Back in the 70s, they were firing bullets at us. So for her, it was considered to be it was considered to be an improvement. But there is a sort of a quotidian, daily violence in Northern Ireland. Most markedly
that's downplayed.
That's downplayed. And also you still have the dissidents. There is a dissident Republican movement now. While it's a very much a sort of a rump minority movement, they did very recently launch a rocket attack against a police Land Rover, which was, as the Independent wrote, inspired by the Taliban. It's sort of these homemade rockets
the Good Friday Agreement's not by any stretch of the imagination the end of the story. But PENKETH, we've seen, just as Patrick was saying, how France has had trouble dealing with its history. We've seen a lot of editorials this week saying, how come it's taken so long to have a state visit by an Irish president to London?
I know, but I think clearly that the Queen's visit, as Gerry mentioned, paved the way for that 3 years ago. And even in that time, Martin McGuinness has moved on, or Sinn Féin has moved on. He at the time did not consider it appropriate to go to a banquet at Dublin Castle. now, only 3 years later, here he is actually toasting the Queen. But yeah, I mean, it will take time, and of course Sinn Féin still believes in a united Ireland. It will take time.
It's still going to take a long time.
But I think the whole symbolic element. I think it's something that the media loves. It's these sort of great reconciliations, and they really look good on the camera. But
it is Martin McGuinness at Windsor Castle,
right? But there is a gritty reality in Northern Ireland, and there's still Northern Ireland is one of the United is if not the most poor region in the United Kingdom. The inequalities in Northern Ireland are still the same, particularly with the Protestant or the traditionally unionist community. They feel very, very much excluded by the peace process. And I think that, if they're looking at who was their greatest enemy, Martin McGuinness, raising his glass to toast the Queen, I think that's probably they probably feel even more alienated and even more disorientated than they have in the last 20 years, because they're that kind of let's say, marginalised Protestant community, unionist community. They considered themselves to be the great losers in the peace process, and whereas the Catholic community was driven by an incredibly controlled and tightly organised Sinn Féin led by McGuinness and Adams.
All right, speaking of peace processes, for all the talk of de-escalation, let's review, if you will, the week's events in Ukraine. Let's see, there was the simultaneous takeover of government buildings by pro-Russian separatists in the east, a troop buildup on the other side of the Russian border that's not abetting, according to the NATO, and the Russian president summoning 18 European nations to cough up for Kiev's $2.2 billion natural gas bill. Cough up, or else, it seems.
The situation is obviously and mildly speaking strange, because as we know, our partners in Europe recognize the legitimacy of the acting Kiev authorities, but do nothing in order to support Ukraine. Not a single dollar, not a single euro.
Christian Wernicke. Not a single dollar, not a single euro. If Europe wants to support Kiev, why don't they pay their gas bill, says the Russian president.
Well, it's not true that the European Union doesn't pay any single dollar. But I mean, this question will come up now to the Europeans. It's not only about paying the bill; it's also about energy security, not only for Ukraine but also for especially for southeastern Europe, EU members, Greece, Bulgaria, who are totally dependent on gas supplies from Ukraine. I like the fact that the EU people, for once, published this letter just to show how Putin works, because beyond the...
You didn't appreciate that.
No, honestly, who cares? I mean, there is no simple solution to this, but the problem is, at the end, it's more than only Ukraine. It is, at the end, the credibility of the West, and it's not only the credibility versus Russia. But when we allow Russia to keep on acting like this, how do you want to keep the Chinese away from scrapping some islands in the South China Sea? I mean, Ukraine, the Russians just took the peninsula of the Crimea, Crimea, and it's for some reason that the American Defense Secretary Jack Hagel just mentioned this incident in Japan before when he visited there, and was referring to some islands in that area. So it is a very, very difficult situation. With the Russians have at least 40,000 troops next to the Ukrainian border, and the West has to play a role backing the Ukraine without too much provoking the Russians, because there are many countries in the international community now who have some sort of sympathy with the Russians. I mean, don't forget that the UN resolution recently, countries like India, Brazil abstained. It's not that the whole world is on the Western side. And so we have to stick to our principles, but at the same time we have to also think that we do it in a way that we get more support against this kind of policy than in the past.
Patrick de Saint-Exupéry?
Yes, what's interesting in that crisis is that basically Ukraine is a diversion crisis created by Putin. His real problem is very simple to say. He has a nightmare. He's not sleeping at night. He's just afraid of Maidan in the Red Place.
In the Red Square.
In the Red Square. He's just afraid of that. And just to divert attention, he's creating artificially this crisis in Ukraine.
He must be sleeping more soundly now that his popularity is at 70 or 80%.
No, because you know, this is Russia is coming back very quickly in the Soviet State Union as the Soviet State Union. So many propaganda, so many artificial discourse. No one is in position to exactly say today what Russians are really thinking. The only thing you can say is Russians are speaking of what's happening in Ukraine hours after hours, 24 hours a day. That's a lot of discussion on that. And you may imagine that the positions are not all the same. But the propaganda, the official propaganda, is so important that there is no way. And we are not so much as media interested to try to listen to different Russian voices, but there are a lot of different Russian voices. I've been 5 years as a Figaro correspondent in Moscow. I've seen the way Putin was going in power, the way he gripped his hands on power. Now he's afraid, and he's acting as he has always been. Nothing new. Everyone knew that. Putin is just a dictator. He's acting as a dictator, creating a diversion crisis in Ukraine, just not to face the situation in Russia.
All right, so Anne PENKETH, what's the response then? You obviously building pipelines is or gas terminals is not something you can snap your fingers and do overnight.
I think we need to be tough. You know, here you've got the playground bully, and there's one thing that he understands, and it's the language of power. Now, military is not on the table, obviously, because Ukraine is not in NATO. But, you know, what we should be doing already, if he's threatening to stop, to turn off the taps, as he did in 2009, we then were supposed to start taking measures because we could see the writing was on the wall. And what was done? Not a lot. So, unfortunately, the EU is, with America, as Chris was saying, we are not being tough. We are completely divided. And what we did at the last EU summit was to ask the European Commission for a report on alternative sources of gas and energy. Well, that's just not sufficient. We need to do something now.
So there has to be a raising, you think, of the pressure.
Yes.
You were talking about the way Russia's spinning the story. Russia's narrative is that fascists have staged a coup in Kiev. This week we saw, though, that there is healthy debate in Ukraine's parliament, like when the leader of the Ukrainian communists blamed the far-right Svoboda party for being part of the problem. There you see the ensuing discussion turns a little bit physical. Gerry, FEEHILY, your thoughts on the way Ukraine is handling it all?
Well, actually, I just wanted to go back to what was said earlier. There seems to be a sort of asymmetry, quite risky, sort of dangerous asymmetry between the way that the EU acts and the way Putin acts. I mean, I think it's very interesting what you just said, but I think to a certain extent the Putin seems to be very much in control.
He's not improvising
of things. His strategy seems to be working. On one hand, he seems to know just how far the West is prepared to act. The West won't intervene militarily, but do we in the West know exactly how far Putin's going to go? We just saw today that the new Ukrainian Prime Minister has actually made concessions to the people in Donetsk concerning autonomy. I mean, this is what they're asking for. They're not asking right now for secession, but they're asking for certain degrees of autonomy. He's prepared now to grant this. This is very much the Russian strategy towards a sort of a fragmentation of Ukraine. while they keep saying that they want Ukraine to remain a sovereign state, they're encouraging a sort of a Bosnification of the Ukrainian territory, and as we've seen in the past, this can eventually lead to a breakup. It'd just be interesting to know just how feasible this is. But it seems to me that the Russians are actually winning in that strategy right now.
Patrick de Saint-Exupéry.
You know, we don't have to forget that 3 weeks ago there were 50,000 people protesting in Moscow against Russian politics in Ukraine. 2 years ago there were big manifestations against Putin. You know, actually we're just forgetting that. It's not possible to forget that. Russian people are trying to say things. There were 50,000 people. You may say only 50,000 people, but in a dictatorship, it's a lot when you have 50,000 people in the street in Moscow. 50,000 people saying to Putin, we disagree with your policy. We should have just a little attention to that.
All right. Tuesday saw the big oral exam of France's new prime minister, Manuel Valls, pledging more tax cuts for businesses and households, a radical downsizing of the number of France's regional elected bodies, and a call to Europe and Germany to loosen monetary policy. At the conclusion of his general policy speech before Parliament, the 51-year-old son of a Spanish exile offered the Gallic rendition of Only in America.
To be Prime Minister of the French government is an immense honor for me. There are very few countries in the world that allow citizens who are born abroad, but who have learned the values of the Republic, to take on the highest positions of responsibility. And that is why I love this country deeply, and that's why I'm proud to be addressing its elected representatives. That's what France is, and it's these values that must unite us all.
Christian Wernicke, what do you think of the new guy?
Well, yeah, big power and perhaps also a big mouth. I was more interested in what he was not saying in the speech. He was not talking about the responsibility that France has towards Europe. I mean, he's talking about how he's handing out some figures. They don't add up, and they don't add up to fulfill his European obligations. And of course, this comes a little bit across like a typical German point of view, but I mean, we share a common currency, we share co-responsibility for that, and for that you have to play by the rules. And the rule is that France is not doing. France has to deliver the reforms, and they are not doing that. I just don't see it. I mean, it's basically already the policy is claiming another delay for coming up with the savings to balance
reducing the budget.
With reducing the budget,
deficit.
And the choice is: do we play again the card that Europe is the bad guy, or do we dare to challenge by freezing, for example, the wages for public employees, or by refraining from handing out goodies to voters. It's the old game, and it's also common in Germany that you play the anti-European card in a way that at the end everybody's antagonized with Europe. In that regard, it's not the main focus of the speech here in France, how it was perceived, but as a European, I have to say I found this underwhelming.
All right. Can Valls make France good for business is a question we're getting on Twitter.
Well, what was quite interesting in the abstract you've diffused, did you listen to the tone of Valls? That was solemn. That was as an actor on scene. It was not politics. It was a theater. He is not serious. The discourse, that speech, is not a serious one. The only serious part of the speech he has done was Rwanda. He spoke on Rwanda at that occasion, which is incredible. And he was saying, well, this is France honor, France honor. Come on, it's just time to be serious, to become serious. And these guys have to become serious.
And PENKETH.
I think that what Hollande wanted was presentation with Valls, basically. You know, he is very firm. He's got the moves, but he's been put in charge of a government which actually reflects Hollande's choices. They keep calling it a fighting government. For me, it's a government which is going to be fighting amongst itself all the time. It's not going to be cohesive. Don't give it very long.
Which brings us to an interesting point. Before the cabinet meeting this week, we got word that now cell phones are banned from the cabinet room. And that announcement coming from, not from Valls, but from Hollande. Gerry FEEHILY, are you inspired by that? Are cell phones now banned at the editorial meetings at the Courrier International?
No, but there was something this week that cell phones are now being banned by in digital and high tech companies after 6 o'clock. You cannot answer your boss's emails after 6 o'clock. So it seems to be something seems to be in the air. I thought that was definitely a very German point of view about playing the rules and everything like this. And I don't think that Valls' speech was necessarily pitched towards the German government in that sense. I think that the problem of Valls, I mean, this could be, I don't think that François Hollande is Jose Mourinho, the manager of Chelsea, but this could be actually a masterstroke on François Hollande's part to actually hamper Valls, who's basically to the right of the Socialist Party, and have him surrounded by something like a firebrand like Montebourg and a lot of very, very, very old socialists coming back from the 90s like Fabius and Ségolène Royal. And let's remember that François Hollande is one of the most unpopular presidents of France at 17%, and his, but it could be strategically one of Hollande's ways of getting rid of probably his most dangerous rival politically.
All right.
Could I just add
very briefly?
Yeah, I mean, what I mean is, I would see a real European commitment, not only in terms of budget, but also in terms of initiatives. At the moment, we have a government where one minister is famous for blaming the European Commission to be Taliban. Mr. Valls is not living up to the commitments, and Monsieur Hollande is not talking about Europe. So that's really disappointing.
And it's all coming up ahead of European elections. I want to thank our panel, and I want to bring in one more person before we say goodbye. And that is Nicholas Rushworth, who does our Media Watch segment. We were talking a minute ago about cell phones. You heard Gerry FEEHILY there saying he's not banned them yet from the editorial meeting at Courrier International. Haven't heard from 21 whether the cell phone is banned there as well. Tell me about it. How is that going down?
Well, it's this, isn't it? It's this scrolling down and staring into your mobile phone. It's the texting like this, going crazy about it. In Switzerland, they've got one step further. There you can see this tweet here. The future has arrived. Swiss flats are actually banning smoking, painting and cell phones outright. This is to do with this story which you can see in the Daily Telegraph. And the people here in these 26 flats are saying, not only can you not come in with the mobile phone, we've actually got a device which prevents the mobile phone actually coming on. So they are basically saying no to the digitally connected society. Now, over on the other side of the planet, we've got a school in Western Australia. Here, the teachers are fed up. They've said no mobile phones during your break, no mobile phones during lunch. Why? Because you aren't talking to each other. You're just texting. You have lost the art of conversation. So not only is it very annoying having that whole thing about having people scrolling and texting through. Hollande is going bonkers, isn't he, during his meetings? It was Cécile Duflot, the former housing minister, who drove him mad, apparently. Now, just to take...
I've heard another name, so that's interesting. Anyway, go on.
Just let me take a fun take of this. If you go to BuzzFeed, which always has a laugh about various mobile phone stories, you can see that story there. What about this kind of scandalous thing? You're there in the courtroom, the judge is about to make his ruling, and he says, did enough people change their Facebook profile pictures? So that whole question of, like, just what limits are there to where you use your mobile phone? Here we can just go to a tweet, which is saying that there's a serious side to this. We're going to have, François, 5 billion mobile phone users by 2017. and the doctors are saying, watch out with that texting and tweeting. Don't do it too much. We can see that the tweet there. So that
Could be.
enough, calm down, don't do it. And I think the reaction online for him was very favourable. It was almost as if it was the only decisive decision ever made.
All right, everybody, that's the word there for this week. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Put down the texting and watch more television. Watch The World This Week. Thanks, Nicholas Rushworth. Thank you. Stay with us. More to come here on France 24.